The year was 1888, and a biting Montana winter held Bitter Creek in its frigid grip. Snowdrifts piled high against the skeletal wooden storefronts, and the air, sharp as a hunter's knife, seemed to slice through even the thickest wool. Into this desolate scene rode Silas Crawford, a man whose face was a roadmap of the high plains, weathered, lined, and perpetually set in a stoic expression. His ranch lay miles beyond the last whisper of civilization, a lonely outpost against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Silas wasn't in Bitter Creek for supplies alone. A deeper, almost desperate quest had driven him from his solitude. Rumors had reached his isolated ranch, whispers of an ancient map, a key to a forgotten claim, supposedly last seen in the hands of a runaway boy, and later with a girl who had offered him shelter. He dismounted outside the ramshackle saloon, the only place in town that offered both a respite from the cold and a nexus for its dark undercurrents. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of cheap whiskey, stale tobacco, and desperation. At a table in the dimmest corner sat Jedediah Thorne, a man whose eyes glinted with a predator's cunning, his influence over the town as suffocating as the winter itself. Jedediah seemed to orchestrate the town's quiet miseries, pulling strings no one else dared to touch. Silas had overheard the hushed conversations, the fearful glances directed towards Jedediah's table, the mentions of a young woman named Elara, held captive by circumstance, or perhaps by something far more sinister. Silas approached Jedediah, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. The negotiation was terse, a dance of veiled threats and calculated risks. Silas offered his most prized possession, a silver pocket watch passed down through generations, and the meager savings he carried, all for the map Jedediah claimed Elara possessed. A sneer twisted Jedediah's lips as he listened. Then he dropped his bombshell. "The map comes with the girl, old man. Take her, or take nothing." The words hung heavy in the smoky air, an unexpected, unwelcome burden. Silas hesitated, a lifetime of solitary independence warring with the burning desire for the map. Yet a strange, unbidden sense of urgency, perhaps even a flicker of compassion for the unseen girl, pushed him forward. He swallowed hard, the taste of ash in his mouth, and reluctantly agreed to the unthinkable bargain. A moment later, Elara was pushed forward, a ghost of a girl. She was thin, her clothes ragged, her shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. Her eyes, when they finally lifted, were a startling, haunted blue, devoid of hope, yet holding a fragile flicker of defiance. The transaction was swift and brutal, a chilling confirmation of her status as property in this god-forsaken place. As Silas led her out of the saloon, the cold embrace of the Montana night felt even more profound. The few townsfolk who watched their departure did so with a mixture of pity and fear, their silence a testament to Jedediah's iron grip. Silas felt the unfamiliar weight of another life beside him as they stepped into the vast, snowy expanse, leaving Bitter Creek and perhaps a piece of his own soul behind. The journey back to Silas's isolated ranch stretched into an agonizing silence, each mile a testament to the vastness of the Montana frontier and the chasm between two strangers. The snow, which had been merely biting in town, now whipped around them in a blinding frenzy, turning the already treacherous path into a blur of white and gray. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at their clothes and clawing at their exposed skin, each gust a freezing reminder of their vulnerability. The wagon creaked and groaned, protesting every turn of the wheel over the uneven terrain, a lonely sound swallowed by the immensity of the desolation that surrounded them, endless stretches of snow-covered plains, punctuated only by the gnarled skeletons of long-dead trees and jagged, ice-encrusted rock formations. Silas, a man accustomed to the comforting rhythm of his own thoughts, found the presence of Elara deeply unsettling. Her silence was not peaceful, but a heavy, impenetrable wall. He tried to question her about the map, his voice gruff, unaccustomed to softness. "Where is it? The map?" he'd ask, his eyes fixed on the horizon, avoiding her gaze. Elara would merely shiver, pulling her thin shawl tighter, her answers barely audible whispers, often just a shake of her head. She seemed to exist in a world far removed from his, her gaze distant, fixed on some unseen point. He could see her trembling from the cold, her small frame racked by hunger. A grudging sense of responsibility began to chip away at his hardened exterior. He reluctantly offered her his worn, patched blanket, the wool rough against her delicate skin, and a piece of hardtack from his meager provisions. He watched as she devoured it, a primal hunger in her eyes that shamed him. With every grueling mile, the initial cynicism Silas felt about his purchase began to erode. He had bought a map, a piece of paper, but he had received a human being, fragile and suffering. The cruelty of the world that had led her to such a fate became starkly evident, and a nascent, unwelcome sense of protection stirred within him. He was no hero, had never been, yet the sight of her shivering, her spirit seemingly broken, awakened something long dormant. He found himself noticing the subtle details, the way her breath plumed in the frigid air, the slight clench of her jaw, the almost imperceptible flinch when the wind howled too close. He cursed himself for his foolishness, for taking on a burden he hadn't asked for. Yet he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the snow, that he couldn't simply abandon her. Elara, for her part, watched the gruff ranchero from beneath the brim of her worn hat. His face was a mask of stoicism, but she saw the fleeting concern in his eyes when he offered the blanket, the slight hesitation before he spoke. She remembered Tom, the boy who had entrusted her with the map, whispering his desperate pleas for her to keep it safe. She had promised him, a promise whispered in the shadows of a hidden cave. The map was not just paper, it was a link to a lost friend, a secret burden she carried, the relentless cold, the vast empty land, the constant threat of wild animals, or worse, the memory of Jedediah and his calculating gaze, all converged to press down on her, yet the flicker of hope, born from a desperate promise, refused to be extinguished. Silas's ranch was a monument to solitude, a collection of weather-beaten log structures hunched against the relentless expanse of the Montana prairie. The main cabin, small and Spartan, offered little comfort beyond its sturdy walls and a crackling fireplace that fought a losing battle against the pervasive chill. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the mournful keen of the wind weaving through the eaves and the distant muffled sounds of the few livestock huddled in the barn. For days after their arrival, Elara moved like a phantom, her presence almost imperceptible. She performed the few chores Silas assigned with quiet efficiency, her movements fluid and uncomplaining, but her words remained few, her eyes still holding that distant, haunted look. Silas, initially relieved by her unobtrusiveness, soon found himself increasingly intrigued by her silent resilience. He would watch her from across the room, observing the quiet determination in her actions, the way she handled even the simplest tasks with a grace that belied her hardship. He began to see past the ragged clothes and the gaunt frame, discerning a sharp intelligence that flickered in her eyes. He tried a different approach, softening his tone, offering small insights into the workings of the ranch, explaining the cycle of the seasons, the harsh realities of their existence. "The map," he'd begin. "What do you know of it?" He'd then pause, waiting, giving her space. Slowly, painstakingly, Elara began to unspool the thread of her life. She spoke of a family lost to sickness, of wandering the unforgiving roads, of the hunger that gnawed at her insides. Then came the story of Tom, a young boy with eyes full of fear and a tattered piece of parchment he called his treasure. He had given it to her, pleading for her to keep it safe before vanishing into the shadows, a victim of Jedediah's ruthless machinations. Each fragmented memory was a painful echo in the quiet cabin, revealing layers of loss and a strength born of unimaginable hardship. A furious blizzard descended upon them, trapping them within the confines of the cabin for days. The relentless snow piled against the windows, blotting out the world, forcing a proximity neither of them had anticipated. The forced intimacy began to chip away at the walls they had built around themselves. Silas, in an uncharacteristic moment of vulnerability, found himself speaking of his own past, a story he hadn't uttered aloud in years. He spoke of his wife, Martha, her laughter a distant echo, her life taken too soon by the relentless fever that swept through the frontier. He described the gaping void her absence had left, the way her death had driven him into the solitude of his ranch, a hermit shielding himself from further pain. Elara listened, her eyes fixed on his, a silent understanding passing between them. As the storm raged outside, a different kind of warmth began to kindle within the cabin. The forced closeness, the shared memories of loss, and the quiet resilience they both possessed forged an unexpected connection. Silas began to see Elara, not as a transactional burden, a mere means to an end for a map, but as a young woman with a rich, albeit painful, history, a spirit that refused to be entirely broken. He saw her courage in the face of adversity, her quiet strength, and Elara, looking at Silas, saw past the gruff exterior, past the lines of hardship on his face, to the deep, abiding grief that had shaped him. She began to glimpse the decency beneath his rough edges, the quiet integrity that hinted at a heart capable of tenderness. The initial distrust began to melt, replaced by a fragile yet profound sense of shared humanity. The first thaw of late winter offered a cruel mockery of hope, turning the treacherous snow into slick, bone-chilling mud as Silas and Elara ventured out in search of the map. Elara, now more open, remembered Tom's fragmented whispers, cryptic clues about the map's hidden location within an old, crumbling barn on the edge of Silas's vast property. The structure stood like a skeletal sentinel against the bleak sky, its timbers rotting, its roof long collapsed in places. The wind whistled through its broken windows, carrying the ghosts of long-abandoned dreams. They navigated the treacherous terrain, Silas leading the way, his eyes scanning for any sign of the grifters who might still be lurking, Elara following closely, her own senses heightened by a newfound resolve to help him. Inside the decaying barn, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Amidst the rubble, they found remnants of an old campsite, a cold fire pit, and discarded tin cans, a chilling reminder that Jedediah's men, or perhaps Jedediah himself, had been here recently, perhaps still were. As they sifted through the debris, Elara's memory suddenly sparked. She pointed to a faded carving on a support beam, a crude symbol Tom had described. He said it was near the broken birdhouse, she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. They moved to the back of the barn, near a leaning, splintered wall where a single dilapidated birdhouse clung precariously. As Silas reached for it, a sudden shadow fell across them. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The voice was a gravelly sneer, and Silas spun around to face Reuben, one of Jedediah's most menacing enforcers, a hulking brute with a malevolent glint in his eyes. Reuben's gaze settled on Elara, a cold, predatory stare that sent a shiver down her spine. "The boss wants his map, girl, and if you ain't got it, well, he's got ways of making you remember." The tension in the dilapidated barn became unbearable, a suffocating weight. Reuben lunged, his intent clear, his hand reaching for Elara. In that instant, something primal ignited within Silas. He was no longer just a ranchero seeking a map. He was a protector. He moved with surprising speed, a lifetime of hard labor, and solitary survival honed into raw, defensive instinct. A brutal, silent struggle ensued. Silas, though older, used his knowledge of the barn, the uneven ground, the low beams to his advantage, feinting and striking with the precise economic movements of a man fighting for his life. Elara, far from being a passive victim, scrambled for a fallen timber, swinging it wildly, her desperate courage catching Reuben off guard, providing Silas a crucial opening. The air filled with grunts, the thud of blows, and the splintering of old wood. They were a strange, unexpected team, each fighting for the other. The true value of their connection, forged in shared hardship and vulnerability, revealed itself in that desperate clash. Silas, driven by a fury he hadn't felt in years, finally managed to incapacitate Reuben, leaving him groaning amidst the debris. Exhausted and bruised, Silas looked at Elara, his chest heaving. The map, now clutched in her hand, suddenly seemed insignificant. The real treasure wasn't a paper promise of fortune. It was the life standing before him, the resilience in Elara's eyes, the unexpected bond that had blossomed between them. The fight had been a brutal awakening. He finally reached out, gently taking the tattered map from her trembling fingers. Not with the greed he had once harbored, but with a profound, newfound understanding of what truly mattered. The crumpled map, now in Silas's possession, felt strangely anticlimactic. It depicted not a vast gold strike, but a small, unremarkable vein of lead ore, valuable to Jedediah perhaps for its potential in munitions, but far from the grand fortune Silas had once imagined. The real treasure, he now understood, was Elara, her life, her resilience, and the unexpected connection they had forged. Yet the map still represented a danger, a lingering threat, as long as Jedediah believed it held his key to power. Silas knew they couldn't simply disappear. Jedediah would hunt them down relentlessly. A new plan began to form in Silas's mind, a dangerous gambit that relied not on evasion, but on a confrontation born of necessity and a desperate hope for justice. He needed to return to Bitter Creek, but this time not as a solitary man seeking a bargain, but as someone prepared to fight for a new kind of future, for Elara's safety, and perhaps for the soul of the town itself. He outlined his audacious plan to Elara, speaking with a newfound conviction that surprised them both. They wouldn't just give Jedediah the map. They would use it as leverage, a tool to expose his villainy and shatter his hold on Bitter Creek. Elara, no longer the timid girl bought for a map, listened intently, her intelligence gleaming in her eyes. She offered her own insights, her sharp observations about Jedediah's network and the desperation of the townsfolk, adding crucial layers to Silas's strategy. She had seen the fear, the subtle acts of defiance, the suppressed anger within the community. Her insights were invaluable, illuminating pathways Silas, in his years of isolation, would never have seen. Together, they refined the details, preparing for a return that promised either liberation or ruin. Their return to Bitter Creek was not clandestine, but deliberate. They bypassed the saloon, heading instead for the dusty general store, a place where the town's silent suffering often gathered. Silas, a man of few words, spoke now with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He spoke of Jedediah's tyranny, of the map, and of Elara's courage. He spoke not of vengeance, but of breaking free. Elara, standing beside him, her gaze steady, was a powerful testament to his words. Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing resolve, the townsfolk began to stir. The blacksmith, whose forge Jedediah had monopolized, the farmer whose meager crops had been seized, the widow whose son had disappeared, they all gathered, their faces etched with years of suppressed fear, now glimmering with a flicker of nascent defiance. The community, inspired by the quiet courage of Silas and Elara, began to coalesce, a fragile but determined force against the man who had long held them captive. The confrontation with Jedediah was not a grand shootout, but a tense, calculated chess match played out in the dusty street. Silas, backed by the growing crowd of townsfolk, faced Jedediah, offering him the map, but on terms that would expose his dealings and dismantle his power. Jedediah, accustomed to unchallenged authority, first sneered, then blustered, then finally, seeing the unwavering resolve in Silas's eyes and the united front of the town, his arrogance began to crumble. He and his remaining henchmen, isolated and outnumbered, were forced to retreat, their control over Bitter Creek shattered, leaving a trail of dust and humiliated defeat. As the sun began to warm the thawing ground, melting the last remnants of winter snow, Elara looked at Silas. She didn't have to stay, the debt was paid, the danger averted. But as she looked at the ranchero who had bought a girl for a map and found something far more profound, she knew where she belonged. The rancho, once a place of solitary hardship, now held the promise of a new horizon, a shared future, and the quiet understanding that the greatest treasures are never found on a map, but in the unexpected connections that transform a lonely life.